Hello, I am Amy Agisi, and I am the resident illustrator at Story Garden. And this is a sequel to my first video about drawing an illustration for going inside of a book. This is more of an actual concept art sort of tutorial, or a video rather. It is more painterly instead of um, sort of more ink focused. And what I'm drawing here is just getting the base colors down for something that's going to be in one of the books called a Quartz dragon. In the books, they're very, very regal, very. They think they're sort of better than the other dragons a little bit, and they're very particular with how they raise their eggs and how they treat other dragons and humans and such beneath them. So uh, they like to decorate themselves in various types of jewelry and trinkets because they want to accentuate their beauty. So I thought that I would do a concept art piece with several sort of copies of the same dragon with examples of their quote unquote clothing that they would wear. And what you saw me looking at just a second ago was some examples of, like dinosaur skulls and stuff like that, just to kind of get a general idea of the sort of structure of where, all the holes in a reptile skull are and how the teeth are structured, just to make sure I got all of that right. And as you can see, there's actually two sources of lighting in this drawing, which is pretty important. I decided to do it to just give it a little bit of extra flair. It helps accentuate a lot of the shapes and show how sort of pearlescent they are, I suppose. So by having a warmer light come from the top left and a cooler light come from the bottom right, it can kind of help show that. And now I'm just going in and doing all of their delicate little scales. There's going to be a lot of layers over this of shading and little scales and highlights and such, and by the end it'll look pretty cool. There's nothing really too difficult about this. It's just a lot of what you would call brute force in terms of brush strokes and detail. And given concept art, usually this would probably be a little too much detail to put in. Concept art is usually more to just get the idea across. Speed is your friend. But this particular piece, I'm only going to about the bottom of the dragon's neck. I'm not doing the whole thing. So I could afford to get away with a little bit of extra detail here and there. Like the scales here, and their changing of size and changing of color as the light refracts off of them. As you'll notice on the parts of the face that logically would be facing up and would be reflecting that warm light, the scales are that sort of warm yellow color. And then where they start to even out, where they wouldn't really be catching either the warm light or the cool light, they become the color that the quartz dragon would naturally be if it was just in a white light room, which is sort of an off white, blue, cool color. Then as it goes towards the bottom and catches that cooler purple light, I draw the scales actually more white, but with the purple that I've put underneath, that shows through just enough to show that that purple light is there refracting without making it too strong. And as you can see, of course, I have some references around, including a much more basic drawing of the quartz dragon on the right, which I did when we were initially coming up with the idea for them. And it's a lot more in line with what I showed in my last tutorial, just a very basic colored sort of ink drawing. And then in the upper right, we have another piece of concept art that I did for a particular quartz dragon that is going to be the main character of an upcoming book, Larimar, She is a little wonky. Um, as you can see, she looks a little more like a pug than a regal dragon, which for the ever appearance focused quartz dragons does not particularly fly. Um, Pun intended. So this was part of a run of concept art I did for that book, um, to get some ideas across of various characters and various locations and things. And this concept art, I think by the time that I was done with it, it took me about maybe about 3 hours. Yeah, about three hours to do, which is pretty good. That's pretty run of the mill as far as concept art goes. Not breakneck fast, but not super slow either. And as you can see, I'm doing the same thing on their little dragony little koi fish sensor organs there on their nose, their little mustaches. And I'm going in and adding more detail to the larger scales on the center of the forehead, going and adding highlights to some, because the scales themselves are actually raised, you have to remember, so they're not just flat. A lot of the smaller ones we can get away without giving them detail because they're so small they would just blend in. But with the larger scales, we have to add just a little bit of a shadow and a little bit of a highlight to show that they are in fact raised and they are in fact catching that light and also blocking it very, very slightly, even if they're only about a centimeter thick or so. And now onto the crystals. The quartz crystals on the back of their head and neck. They are very, very symmetrical. They preen them. They're very sort of, I guess, almost would look like the Fortress of Solitude. As you can see, Laramar's look more like warbled glass. It's very, very different from all of her relatives. And now I'm actually going in and I'm doing a very important part, which is very easy to miss out on in a lot of digital art, which is the shadows, especially in a piece like this with a black background. It's very, very tempting with digital art to sort of make everything too smooth and too bright and not use dark colors and not use dark shadows, because it almost feels like it almost feels too permanent, right? I suppose is a way that you could say that. But it's very important if you want something with a piece with strong contrast that's really striking. Sometimes shadows in real life are that dark, and you have to think about it logically in terms of where that light would fall and where no light would be hitting. Sort of like, I guess I like to imagine light as like a stream of water, like coming out of like a sprayer in your sink. This is a very strange analogy, but it's spraying from one direction and it's fanning out, and the water is, or the light is, only going in straight lines. And so if you imagine sort of rays of lines coming from those little points that I drew to help visualize where the light is coming from, if you sort of imagine as a three-dimensional shape where either of those lines would hit, if there's a spot where neither of those lines would hit it, it would be black. There'd be no light there. And now moving on to the horns, which of course has a very different texture to them than the skin. There's no scales on the horns, obviously. It's just like keratin and bone. And this is a very important thing in a lot of digital art that is also very easy to miss. Along with ignoring dark shadows, it's very easy to not think about your textures. But textures are hugely important in all artwork, but in digital artwork specifically, you don't get any impasto, you don't get any texture that you would get if you were painting physically, or if you were drawing physically. There's no natural roughness to it from a piece of paper. It's all super smooth, and so any sort of texture that you would put on it is simply what you choose actively to put there. And if you just draw everything with a regular round brush in Photoshop, even if all of your tones are very good, even if all of your values are very good and all of your forms and everything are spot on, it might end up looking a little bit flat and not quite how you want it. Because I went in and I did all those fine details with the scales, and then the horns I've left relatively more simple, you can really see the difference between those two parts of the dragon and the crystals reflecting the light and even the different sizes of the scales. It really makes it a lot more pleasant and a lot more dynamic to look at. It gives you something to look at and makes it feel less like a two-dimensional image that's trying to trick you into thinking that it's three-dimensional, because at the end of the day, that is what all drawings and illustrations really are. And of course, you can use 3D to help with concept art. That is a very valid technique to use. A lot of people do it. I will actually do a tutorial on it sometime. I do it a lot. But even then, you can't just sort of make a flat, low poly 3D model and then add color to it and then that's done. You have to paint over it, and then you have to add that texture and add that life to it that makes it feel like real, either like paint, or if you're going photorealistic, like a real sort of breathing thing. And that was definitely my goal here. You'll see while I was talking, I added sort of I believe I did an overlay of blue over the whole thing to kind of add to that pearlescent sheen that I was talking about that I wanted the dragon to have. And now I'm actually adding highlights onto the teeth, where the sort of like saliva and everything and all those, gross dragony bits would be making those razor sharp teeth shine in the light. I'm just going in and sort of adjusting my shapes, getting everything symmetrical, making sure that it all blends in properly, getting everything to my liking, exactly how I really want it. Sort of adding extra highlights where extra highlights might be needed and extra shadows where extra shadows might be needed. Remember, in digital art, one really good thing about it is that even if for some reason you're a psychopath and you draw everything on one layer in Photoshop, there's always the undo button and the step backward button, which can give you a fair amount of leeway. And it is, I suppose if you ever heard the phrase of like happy little accidents with Bob Ross, like everything could be corrected with painting. That's true in traditional mediums, but it is even more true in digital mediums. Be bold, be striking, always go for what your imagination is telling you to go for. Don't try to dumb it down. Don't try to make it more digestible, because you can always do that at the end. Go big, go bombastic, use bright colors and dark shadows and striking shapes, because you can always go back later with the liquefy tool or the warp tool, or change the values and do whatever you need to do at the end. Take layers away, add layers to get it to a more digestible form if what you were originally doing wasn't working for some reason. And sometimes you may find that crazy thing that you're doing at the beginning when you just are trying to have fun is actually completely amazing. And if you wouldn't have done that, you wouldn't know. You would have never made that really cool, really unique piece of artwork if you didn't go nuts from the get-go and then try to dial yourself back later. And now, a really big part of this was the dragon's neck. Their head is pretty much done now, and I'm just sort of doing the same process that I did for the neck, or for the head, for their neck. Adding on the side there some bumpy textures to show that the scales are once again three-dimensional and catching the light to really get that silhouette right. That's another thing in digital art. There is a tendency, a want, if you're a beginner, to make everything super smooth and super soft, and to always use that soft airbrush tool. And that's great when you're on the inside of a shape, but one of the most important things in artwork is you really want hard, defined edges around the silhouette, especially if you have a character. You want really defined, really dynamic shapes that will catch someone's eye. You want to have a silhouette that is good to look at, has a nice flow to it visually, and doesn't just sort of blend into the background. Because in real life, there are hard edges to things quite consistently. And there is a tendency with beginners sometimes to not want to make something look like a cartoon. Like that would be drawn with like pen and ink and has all hard edges. And so you go to the opposite direction and you try to make everything soft and fade and have, like really smooth shading. And to a certain degree, that's good. But don't be afraid of shadows and don't be afraid of hard edges. If you just are strong and confident in your artwork, you can always go back and fix it later if you want. Just have no fear and you'll get to where you want to go. And now, once again, I've finished the dragon. So now I'm moving on to the original idea of what I was saying I was doing, of doing one dragon in different outfits or multiple dragons with, different sort of jewels and baubles and things. And this is actually a really good example of the sort of concept art process. A lot of times when you do concept art, you do a piece, you show it to your creative director, and then they will sort of point you in a direction based on that of what they like, what they didn't like, what they may be looking for. I did that initial very basic Quartz dragon sketch right there that's, it's sort of in the left that I've been using as reference this whole time. And really liked the shape of the dragon, really liked the long neck, really liked how graceful it was and the horns. But they thought that maybe it was just it had a little bit too many baubles on it. And I ended up agreeing. So in this second go around where I'm doing a more realistic take on it, I'm taking the different baubles and the different elements in the original one I did, but I'm sort of breaking them up a little bit between the different dragons, like the little head jewel, which when I was coming up with this, the idea that I had was that the Quartz dragons, they're sort of almost, they're like dragon supremacists, I suppose, amongst themselves. And so sometimes they will hunt and track down other types of dragons, and they will, eliminate them, so to say, and they'll, wear their jewels as trophies, despite thinking that those dragons are so ugly. They will also wear their jewels as trophies and jewelry because they think it's pretty. They're hypocritical. So that's the sort of lore reason there for why they sometimes decorate themselves with the jewels of other dragons and other animals, and put little golden bangles around their horns, like they think themselves the most naturally beautiful things in existence, but they also are constantly trying to accentuate that with other things. And I think there's a sort of maybe a little bit of an inferiority complex with it. There's something there. A lot of this story has to do with a lot of like self-worth themes and some self-harm themes and like body image issues and things like that. So of course these dragons, are more or less a metaphor for beauty standards and things like that. So the goal is to have them be, somewhat over the top and somewhat gaudy, but within reason, and at least enough that they still look pleasing from a design perspective. Like they're not hard, they're not busy, they're not hard to look at. So this one, I decided to pretty much just stick to his or her really complex headdress, and then add some more basic just bangles around or necklaces around the neck. And on this first one, I actually went to the trouble to go in and hand paint the highlights on the gold. It looks quite nice, but I was coming down to kind of a time crunch at the end here with the next couple of dragons I do, so you'll find that some of them I figured out that from a distance the emboss tool works just as well for the gold, when zoomed out so far, so I end up using that here in a second. And once again, there's no real shame in that. If you figure out a faster way to do something that's good enough with concept art, generally that's what you want to do, because it's not fine art. It's not going in a museum. If you're lucky, it might end up in like a coffee table book, or in like a DVD extras menu. But the main goal is to help the creative team, which in this instance I'm a part of. That's not true in all companies. Some companies are very separated in their departments. But no matter what the case, it is to help the creative team and the director or the creative lead or whoever is in the head of your project to visualize what they're trying to do. Whether that is making a book and it's to help the writers visualize and describe things like we're doing, or it's for a movie and it's to help the visual effects artists have something to work off of when they're making digital characters or something like that. The whole point of concept art is to get the point across and to communicate that point effectively and to get it done fast and dirty. So if you have to use 3D models as a base for what you're doing, do that. If you have to use all of Photoshop's little tricks, do that. It's not cheating. They're tools at your disposal. And see, it saved me how much time. Imagine if I had to go in and shade all of those little rings around the dragon's horns and around its little decorative veil muzzle thing. That would have been, probably would have added a whole extra like 40 minutes onto this. And because I didn't do that from a distance, looks just as good, and I was able to give it to my boss all that much faster and move on to the next thing. Of course, here for the sort of translucent veil, just doing some basic shading, finishing that up. I was trying to sort of give a really big variety here of things that they could be wearing. Some that are more feminine, some that may be more minimalist and masculine, like the second one from the right. And of course I left the one on the left completely blank. And here it is. This is the final product. And as you can see, it was a pretty simple process, step by step. If you looked at this finished, you may think, oh wow, I could never paint something like that. But don't knock yourself. You might. Just take it one step at a time. And I'll see you again for another tutorial sometime. It's nice. I always love talking to you guys and, showing these videos and showing people how to draw. So, yeah, I'll see you. Have a good day, everyone.